Welcome to Lecture 4, Post-Western Sport. Let's not forget that this topic is the last topic in the second module, and the module is titled Global Sport Systems. So what we're going to do in this module is focus on the way that global sport systems have changed over time, from having a British influence to an American influence, and more recently in the 21st century, we have the influence of non-Western nations in shaping the global sport system, both externally and examining how internally they are recreating their sport within the 21st century or the new age of global sport. Within this topic, we will look specifically into India as the case study for the country that we're going to look at and how it has changed over time. Also, in the first part of this topic, we will look at how non-Western nations have come to the forefront. I know you've seen this before, but we're going to use it again, because what we're looking at here is the dark green. Last time we looked at this post-industrial Americanized phase of sporting influence. Here, we're looking at Phase 5 of Maguire's model, and Phase 5 looks at the rise of non-Western nations, or the Global South, and their influence on the recreation of global sport. Here in more detail is Phase 5 of that sportization process, which is that development of a global sport system dominated by hegemonic sport forms. What we have here is, according to Maguire, the rise of non-Western nations. He positions it as from the late 1960s onwards. What this phase is all about is not the total decline of American and British influence, but the rising influence of the non-Western nations, not only in their prominence within the organization and administration of sport, but also in playing and localizing aspects of the games. So over the last 30 or 40 years, what we have seen is non-Western nations coming to the fore within the global sport system. Also, you could argue that within this period, we've seen the rise of non-Western nations generally come to the fore in terms of economics and politics around the world. So sport is really demonstrating what is going on within wider global society. And here we have the outline of what we will look at. Again, for major topics, 4 major topics and a summary. And we're going to look at the transition in the world system. Again, we can see the influence of Wallerstein here and his global sport in his global system. First, the rise of post-Western sport, and then focusing specifically in topics 3 and 4 on cricket within India and how cricket's emergence within India speaks to the rise of non-Western influence on sport. What we are talking about in this first section is the notion that the world system is in transition. But as we've seen previously, the world system is always in transition. What type of transition is going on at the moment? This speaks to the world system hegemony and the cycles of dominance within the world system. We had the Dutch, the British, and American dominance. And now we are going into a phase where there is no single dominant power or no world system hegemony. The U.S. is dominant perhaps as it was in the 1950s and 60s, and other powers, be it China, India, Russia, are not necessarily taking over, but they are challenging the U.S. dominance of that world system. And that is because, as we've talked about previously, it is fluid, it's changing, but the hegemony of the world system constantly has to be won and re-won and is being fought over. The U.S. moved from a peripheral to a core nation, which I don't see moving to the semi-periphery anytime soon, as it's maintained its power at the core, but it's being joined by emergent nations, non-Western nations, such as China, India, and Russia. Now, those are still perceived as being somewhat on the semi-periphery, but are increasingly crossing the line into the core. And once they do, categorically, they will even more challenge the U.S.'s position of hegemony and its position as a leading power within the world system. And it could be argued that these nations have already done that. Certainly, if we look at the influence of Russia in global politics, the 2016 election, there are questions about both economics and also political interventions by some of these nations. And this is why, while the 20th century was the American century, people do question whether the U.S. will have anywhere near the same type of power and influence on the world system going forward. Most people say no, it will not have the same type of hegemonic, largely unquestioned, dominant presence as it did in the 20th century. Here are the phases of the U.S.'s hegemonic power, and it's currently in hegemonic decline, as we might argue. This does not mean that it doesn't mean that it's not the leading economic, political, or military power in the world, but its hegemonic control, its dominance as a seemingly unassailable influence is not what it's previously been, as other nations have come to the fore. Within the period of the U.S. hegemony of the world system, this is the way people modeled the American influence. As the USA dominated, it was the hub of everything, and it would dominate influence from the UK all the way around to West Germany. This is what the influence was during the period of the 1940s to the 1980s, maybe even the 1990s. This is the argument with the US at the hub and the other countries as the spokes on that hub. And this is what Zakaria talks about. The world was moving toward a hub and spoke system going through the United States to get to its destination. During that period, if you wanted to develop as a modern independent nation, you had to work with and get support financially, symbolically, militarily, politically, economically of the U.S. at the time. Now the argument goes that the U.S. doesn't hold that central position any longer. We are in a period of transition. As a result of waning U.S. economic and political dominance, still the leading power, but it's not as economically powerful and undisputed as it once was. The rival core economic powers are now Japan, China, post-communist Russia, and even the European Union, a constellation of many European nations that have come to the fore as the economic and political significance of the semi-periphery nations of Brazil, China, and India. So those nations all coming together are challenging the political, economic, and perhaps military supremacy of the U.S. as that single dominant power. There were many discussions of this, and Zakaria came out with a well-known book talking about the post-American world and the rise of the rest. America hasn't disappeared, it's just that its unassailable political position of leadership and influence in the world isn't what it was previously. Why is that? Zakaria argues that to some degree the U.S. has created its own competitors, to some degree. It has helped stimulate democratic capitalism in many of the spoke nations, and now these nations have risen to challenge the power of the nation that helped them get to this position. As a result, these nations are independent, modern, thriving economic forces and don't rely on the U.S. as they formerly did. They are now competitors to the U.S. in the world system and don't have to go through the U.S. as they developed and have significant independent standing. So Zakaria says while the political and military strength of the U.S. remains, its economic cultural dominance, its cultural imperialism isn't what it was before because these competing nations have come to the prominence within the global system. So we are post-American in terms of America being the influence of the 20th century. Basically, here he is saying the same thing of what I had just said. These competing nations that the U.S. had to help to develop now don't need to rely on the U.S. as an engine of their progress. They are independent and shape the country based on their own national histories, needs, and aspirations. So there's a different model we have to look at. And this is one way to think about it, that these nations, as the U.S. is the dominant or center of everything else as the spoke, instead, there is a much more complex network of global relations. So China, Russia, India, you could go to every country in the world here, and they're linked in multiple complex and diffuse ways. They are also linked to other nations within the global system based on their affiliations, their industrial needs, and their cultural interests that they might have different linkages with. So while they still do connect to the U.S., they don't always have to go through the U.S. You have independent relationships between independent nations. Now, here is that other way of thinking about it that Zakaria talks about, that the 21st century is better described as point-to-point routes within new patterns, networks, or relationships that mean countries are increasingly interested in themselves. So rather than having to go through the dominant U.S., they determine what they want to do and may trade with the U.S. or with others based on their particular needs because they are thriving independent nations. So there's a huge difference between this model here and the hub and spoke model we viewed prior. The U.S. is still prominent, just not the single unassailable power. People have argued, therefore, that what we have then is this, a world that is post-American. Now, previously, as you can imagine with the hub and spoke model, there was a great deal of anti-American sentiment because many people felt that the US was overbearing and a cultural imperialist influence on the rest of the world. Under the new model, there's a new way of thinking about it. It's not a matter of anger because of anti-Americanism. There is not the same Yankee go home feeling. There is more indifference to America. They're interested in the US, and the US is potentially important, but not more important than relationships with Russia, India, or the European Union. It's not anger, it's indifference toward America, and I think that indifference perhaps may be a bit strong, maybe it's a bit more ambivalence, but yes, America is good, and what we might think from America is that there are these emergent places elsewhere in the world. So that's what post-Americanism is. Yes, America is still a leading influence, but it's not the single influence in the world. So post-Americanism is a reworked view and position of the US within that world system. But there are other posts we need to consider as well. The second half of the 20th century was a period of post-colonialization, where the majority colonial powers, Britain and France particularly, granted independence to nations or territories that were previously colonies. The clearest example of this is India and perhaps Algeria. Those nations, some of them anyway, have developed quite independently and are moving from periphery to semi-periphery, and India, once the colony, now flourishing to some degree as an independent nation, is now perhaps moving from semi-periphery to the core. So post-colonialization has reworked the world system, as has post-communism. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, the breakup of that structure and its satellite states has seen a number of independent nations emerge as flourishing, developed, modernized democratic capitalist nations to more degree than they were. Also, China has in the same period shifted from a rigid communist state economy to a socialist market economy. So it's liberalizing trade and international relations, becoming an important consumer market as well. This post-communism shift has also changed the world system, and all these things add up together. This post-Americanization, post-colonialization, and post-communization, we get this understanding of a post-Western world. And clearly it's closely tied to Americanization, but really this speaks to the decline of the West, specifically that global North American and Northwest Europe axis, and their influence and form of culture and civilization or societies on the rest of the world. The US, Britain, Germany, France, there is a decline here of the powers of the 19th and 20th century, and now in the world system, there's been a rise of the non-West, particularly China, India, Russia, Brazil springing to mind. So these countries are moving from semi-periphery to periphery, perhaps even to the core, and are challenging the Western dominance of the world system. So I want you to think about this. These are key, these post terms, as they do shape the sport world that we are now entering and will discuss in the remainder of this lecture. So we have precisely that, post-Western sport, from the West to the rest. And I think we can think in terms of Westernization as a process whereby the Western civilizations influence global cultures, economies, and systems. That was a process from really the 1400s to the 1900s, whereby the West really did dominate the rest of the world or the non-Western world. Early British Westernization, here we have the missionaries going to India to impose British culture, values, and religion on the indigenous population. And later, American Westernization was the spread of American culture, values, way of doing things, and an economic system tied to capitalism based on the production and consumption of goods and services. So we have to think about the various phases of Westernization, but it was a huge influence on shaping the global system and the world during that period. Now, as hopefully you can tell from what we've said and talked about, the global sport system, as it was developed from the 19th century and as it emerged and diffused around the rest of the world in the 20th century, is very much a Western model of sport. It was developed within Western societies and was part of those industrializing modern societies and spread to the rest of the world. Things such as the Olympic Games seem like a global entity, but it was very much rooted in 19th century Western Europe and a modernizing society that was looking to advance itself through sport and sporting practices. And even the motto of the Olympic Games translates to faster, higher, stronger. It speaks to that Western-oriented focus on rational, organized, and productive-oriented society, linked to industrial capitalism. And it's using the body to be more effective, more efficient, and we can look at this in American football as nothing is perhaps better illustrating this industrialized, rationalized body than the standardized, codified, and achievement-oriented sport of American football. It's all about productivity, specialized roles, and we measure that productivity in yards every time American football is played. Again, it speaks to the particular Western aspects of modern societies that are rational, organized, and productively oriented around sport. So there's this clear linkage between industrial capitalism and the logics therein and the sporting practices that emerged in the 20th century. So when we look at this map of sportization, these are, I think, virtually, but maybe we could argue kickboxing is not Western, is non-Western. And that's debatable. All of these sports are Western products that have been spread around the world. The process of sportization is one that is rooted in the West. There is and this is categorically, and there's really no doubt about this. Now we come to this position where we are in the post-Western moment. What has happened to sport in this moment, where the dominant centrality and influence of the West isn't what it was today, what it was maybe 50 or 100 years ago. And here we're talking about this process of post-Westernization, the process where the West is having less influence on the global system than it once had. And there are three main elements to this that Rumford talks about, and I'll briefly go over two, and then we'll focus on the third. The first is, because of the breakup of the British hegemony and then the American hegemony, the West lacks unity, as it does not have a central leader or focus. As a result, there being multiple different narratives going on in Western civilizations. These are, in other words, diffuse cultures. And so whilst we might talk about post-Western nations in a ubiquitous sense, there are clear local cultural differences between some of these countries, be it Russia, China, India, so forth and so on. Secondly, even external to the West, there are competing narratives or different views of what the modern nation should look like, be they communist or Islamic views that challenge the Western assumptions. So there are internal and external challenges of the West leadership and shaping the global system. Thirdly, and this is one we're going to focus on, as a result of the emergence of the non-West, the East, as Rumford crudely puts it, is having a bigger and bigger influence on shaping not only its own affairs, but the non-West is beginning to shape global affairs as well in a way that it hasn't done before. So the non-West is challenging the centrality and singular importance of the West, the US and Western Europe, in dictating and leading world civilization. So this post-Westernization is a relatively new thing that, according to Maguire, has happened since really the 1960s and 70s, especially in sport, but in society as well. What we've got then is the emergence of these BRIC economies. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa is really symptomatic of the rise of non-Western and the decline of the West. So the BRICS are an expression of this post-Westernization. There are economies and societies that are challenging the Western nations that have historically dominated the global system. It doesn't mean that the U.S.'s position of leadership still remains unimportant politically, economically, and arguably culturally, but its position is being challenged by multiple different sources of these non-Western nations. So, how about sport? Where does this fit in? Quite simply, there are a number of things going on that we have seen in non-Western influences, and they have redrawn the hierarchy within the global sports system. Number one is that international sport organizations recognize the importance of the non-West because of the non-West markets, and many of these international governing bodies are expanding and developing the economies to grow consumer culture. And that's where the IOC and FIFA see room for growth and profits, penetrating these non-Western nations. We've seen a saturation in the West in terms of the sports market. There's really no room for more expansion, but there is room for growth in these non-Western economies, untapped markets of potential consumers. So it's an economic decision, if nothing else, because developing non-Western nations is where economic growth can be had. And so that's where we get to in phase 5 of the sportization process. the rise of non-Western nations. In sport, they have political clout because they have growing economic strength that governing bodies or international organizations want to tap into. I want to give you a couple examples to consider. The first one you're probably not that familiar with, and we'll see if at all any of these non-Western nations examples come to mind. The first organization is the Commonwealth Games, and you may not know what that is, but it's happened in Glasgow in 2014. The Commonwealth Games are a multi-sport event, like a mini Olympics, that involves 53 member states and nations within the Commonwealth of Nations, and those were mainly states or territories that had once been part of the British Empire. Originally, they were called the British Empire Games, but as the decolonization happened, they went with the British Commonwealth and Empire Games, to then the British Commonwealth Games, and then to simply the Commonwealth Games from 1978 onward. And they are a way for these Commonwealth nations to create harmony and goodwill that are now linked by trade and various forms of support that Britain gave to them rather than being linked by colonial relations. So it's something different, but it's a big thing with nearly 5,000 athletes, 71 countries and territories that take place, even though there are only 53 nations in it. It is, in this sort of global hierarchy of international sport mega events, just below the FIFA Men's World Cup and the Olympic Games in terms of its prestige and importance. Now, the Commonwealth Games really just happened here in 2018 in Queensland in Australia, and it was a rather big deal and a very interesting event. And it seems quite a good measure to see whether there has been this post-Westernization of sport, because there's a decolonialized organization. One way of looking at this, then, perhaps, is to see every 4 years where the Commonwealth Games have been cited over time since 1930. And here's a map of that, and as you can see, they are largely concentrated in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. There were 3 on the periphery or semi-periphery nations: Kingston, Jamaica in 1966, Malaysia 1998, and Delhi in 2010. And Delhi was the biggest one recently of a semi-periphery nation taking on the Commonwealth Games. And if we look at it more broadly and divide the nations into Wallerstein's core, semi-periphery, and periphery nations, then I would argue that this is an expression of post-Westernization. The Commonwealth Games remain surprisingly Western, except the 2 semi-periphery and single periphery of Kingston being examples of where anything other than non-core nations have taken the Games. And you may argue that this is because of these nations don't have the financial ability to do so, and that may be a good argument, but it does not seem a good reflection of that post-Westernization argument. So the Commonwealth Games resolutely continue to be in Western-dominated nations. Now, if we move on to the Summer Olympic Games and look at a map of that, and we consider that if there is any evidence of this post-Westernization here. And the map seems largely focused on Western Europe and quite a few in North America. But if we look at a similar breakdown, I think we can see the semi-periphery from Athens in 1896 has been well represented in the Olympic Games. And increasingly over the past decade since Athens in 2004, 3 of the last Summer Olympics have been in semi-periphery nations, and this is arguably because what we see in the Olympics is more of a global institution that is looking to incorporate things from more and more nations and penetrate new markets. Or it could be argued that there is a recognition of the need to stimulate sports within the growing, developed consumer marketplace of these semi-periphery nations in order to sustain the Olympic movement. Maybe the core nations are saturated, they're full, consumers are already committed, and the semi-periphery holds growth. But of course, no non-periphery nation has ever held the Games, and I would think that it's because of the cost simply to. If we look at Rio 2016, it's a great example of this post-Westernization, this identification of the increased importance and role of non-core or non-Western nations. And there's debate whether Brazil is Western or not, but in economic terms, it is securely on the semi-periphery of the world system. Brazil even argued in its bid presentation to secure the Games that there was a Western domination of hosting, as seen in this graphic, with 42 of them being held in North America and Western Europe, 7 in Australia and Asia, and 1 in South America. So there was a great imbalance there, and they were suggesting to readjust the balance by hosting the 2016 Games in Brazil. If Brazil had not been one of the thriving BRIC economies at that time and was perceived as being somewhere that the games could not flourish and markets could not be expanded, it probably would not have gotten the games. It was recognized as being an appropriate and strategic choice for the games, not only for Brazil, but also for the international Olympic movement. So there is post-Western influence at work. And let's look at the World Cup. And again, it seems largely dominated by Western Europe. But if we look at the core, semi-periphery, and periphery, what we see here, and if you take it apart, the World Cup from the start has been more balanced than the Commonwealth Games, and arguably as balanced as the Olympic Games. And again, it comes down to the same argument that FIFA would like to expand and encourage the growth of sport, the game, and the economy around the world to these semi-periphery nations, especially from 2010 onwards. These core nations have had their focus from 1990 to 2006, and clearly the rise of perceived importance of engaging non-Western economies and nations for FIFA was recognized, hence those nations were awarded games: South Africa, Brazil, Russia, and Qatar. I think that's quite a significant demonstration, and yes, the semi-periphery, due to the global popularity of these games, was well represented in the past, but clearly post-non-Western influence has had a great impact in the hosting of the games over the past decade and will continue to do so for the future. So as we said, South Africa 2010, Brazil 2014, Russia 2018, and Qatar 2022. So I think this is quite a significant and good demonstration of what we're talking about that fifth phase of sportization, the rise of the influence of non-Western nations, and perhaps FIFA is the best example of that. So up to this point, we've talked about the rise of non-Western influence on the global sports system, more generally, through these big organizations and the hosting of these sport mega events, and just the political and economic power that the non-West has. Now we're going to focus on India and the degree to which a non-Western country has assumed a greater influence within a specific sport. And what we are talking about here is the Indianization of cricket, and specifically how within the Indian context since 1947 and the independence of India, the game has been localized as a response to two forces. Initially, the British nature of the game, and second, the way that the American sport model has influenced the shape and delivery and experience of the game. So precisely what is cricket? Here's a great example of an introductory or a primer for Americans on the sport of cricket. Some of the rules, the different forms, the different codes, as the game has simply evolved over time. So take a look at this video if you are curious about how cricket is played and how it's analogous to some extent to baseball. Watch this video. Additionally, there's a great Netflix show called Explained, where in 2018 they had an episode on exactly what is cricket and the global shifts that link to exactly what we're talking about here. So if you're thinking about doing your essay on this topic, I think you should take a look at the Netflix show Explained if you have a Netflix subscription, and check out the 15-minute video or primer on cricket. But let's look at these more specifically, and this is a very short clip, and I thought you could see what cricket was like a long time ago. This is the colonial form of cricket from 1956, and you can see the type of game that it was. You may not understand completely what's going on. Hopefully the American Guide to Cricket will elucidate some of these complexities, but you can see who is playing, how they are playing, what the crowd was like, etc. This is England and Australia, and from 1947 onwards, when India gained its independence, India had a team before that, as we can see. But that English game was appropriated more and more into Indian culture. It had become more and more a part of what it meant to be Indian. It's viewed as a religion, so to speak, and that's a bit of a cliche many people use, but it is to some degree a truth. The country comes to a stop when cricket matches are played in India, the roads are deserted, Parliament goes in for early closing. Cricket is a perpetual conversation in India where everyone has a view, and cricket is bigger in India than football is in England, which is quite a big statement. India is a cricketing country, and that, as I say, has helped to define an Indian national identity post-1947 and its independence. And it's been part and parcel that's been closely linked to its cricket identity. So there's a relationship between the emergence of cricket, national identity, in a post-independent India. So cricket is a core part of Indian values and culture, and so in a way it's become a British game that was localized or Indianized relatively quickly. So much so that if you go to India, it is a core part of Indian culture, whether it be playing or spectating or viewing. It is a key part of life within the Indian subcontinent. And so this is all well and good, and it's an important and interesting cultural thing, but it becomes more significant once India as a nation becomes more economically and politically significant. And this is how India became a bigger player on the world stage, a non-Western influence on the world stage. And it was because of this. Quite simply, the rise of the Indian economy. You've got 1.2 billion people within the nation, and as that economy develops, that huge population, even slightly a few percentage points more affluent as the industrial development of the country occurs, so the GDP, the wealth of the nation, generates more economic revenue, more discretionary spending among consumers. As the Indian population becomes more affluent, they can use their discretionary income from this industrialization on goods and services. So what we see then within the Indian population is a massive rise, and even more projected rise in the future, of the Indian middle class. Now, the Indian middle class is not the same as the U.S. middle class. It does not have the same amount of wealth or the total buying power, but has more buying power than the rest of Indian society. It is still a relatively affluent group when compared to many other people in India. So now the Indian middle class is estimated to be somewhat over 300 million people, which is roughly the total size of the U.S. So you have an Indian consuming middle class who has more and more free time and discretionary income that is now a massive marketplace and important for companies within India and companies outside of India to capture. And so you can see this is the projected growth even further. And you're going to have by 2025 1.4 billion people, which is massive, of course. So the economy in India is of great interest to many people because of this middle class grouping. The rising middle class culture of consumption. This group has found a new affluence and willingness to spend within the consumer marketplace. So that's why, if you like, India has come to the fore in the last 20 years because of this rising affluence and growing economic power of this expanding Indian middle class. So what effect has this had on sport and cricket, particularly this as a non-Western economic phenomenon? And here we have it. And we've spoken about it before, but cricket was a Western British-dominated sport or tradition. But if you like, the political and economic shifts within cricket have caused India to become a hub of the cricket world. It is no longer London, where the International Cricket Council was. It's now in India. Why? Because India is so obsessed with cricket and aligned with its national identity, and it has a massive 300 million cricket-obsessed middle class willing to spend on viewing, watching, and buying things related to cricket. Within a generation, the epicenter of the world sport of cricket has shifted from England to India. And as a result, an example of the post-westernization of cricket, as Rumford talks about, the headquarters of the International Cricket Council, of all things, was moved from London to Dubai. Why Dubai? It's part of the United Arab Emirates, and there was no cricket there to speak of, but it was positioned here because of its closeness to India in 2005, purely because of the rise in and significance of the market and consumer within the marketplace. Which means by now that the board of cricket for India is arguably the political, economic, and symbolic center of global cricket. It is the dominating force within the game, shaping the game and the organization of the game within many different ways. Whereas Britain used to be the previous power structure, there has been a total overhaul by the emergence of India as this new modernizing consumer-driven nation with 300 million people in its middle class. So this non-Western nation has grabbed hold of cricket and is now influencing and shaping the game more than ever before. The BCCI's rise of global influence has threatened the centrality of the International Cricket Council as the authority and the world governing body of cricket and all the member associations. There's this territorial battle between control over the influenced the political and economic importance of the global game of cricket. The staging of the World Cup was shrunk to less teams based on basically India's demand that they get greater television coverage. So some of these emergent nations that aren't cricket superpowers are no longer on television. India can play more matches, Indian sponsors are more happy, and therefore there's a greater likelihood that India wins the Cricket World Cup. And you can see here from the map, here are all the different nations that play cricket around the world. The ones in red are the primary cricket nations, and secondary cricket nations are in orange. And then lighter shades are also parts where the game is played. And all of these, all of their power together, stand and pale in comparison to ultimately the BCCI's influence over the global game. All of this is captured in this rather lengthy video from Hassan Minhaj on his Netflix special. It talks about the growth and rising power and influence of the BCCI, their version of the game, a more spectacularized, shorter version, and that influence over the global game. There comes with it some political corruption, some complicated arrangements between commercial sponsors, and the figures driving this global growth. It's a rather lengthy clip. I encourage you to watch it because I think it really teases out both the pros and cons of the shifting tides around the emergence of this post-Western cricket nation of India. Such that I think you can think of perhaps maybe us rethinking this hub and spoke model. That perhaps, even if we want to define this moment as a much more diffuse network of relationships and interrelationships, it may be argued that we're back to a hub and spoke model where India is at the centrality of the global sport cricket system. That's up for you to decide. I want you to take a look at that video again. It's rather lengthy, but it's certainly worth your time in completely understanding and putting together both the British influence, the sporting Americanization, and ultimately the emergence of Indian cricket as that global sport system has become non-Westernized. So it's the perfect sort of bringing together of the previous two lectures and this one as well. Now, within this context, locally, within the country of India, there is this rising thing of what we call T20 cricket. Remember the image you saw of cricket in 1956 at the beginning of this section of the lecture? We have the emergence driven by the BCCI of a new form of the game, which was actually invented within England, but has been taken up in India as the preferred form of cricket. Ironically, what this does is bring us together. It's a hybrid of the American forms of sport delivery, that soft sporting Americanization that we talked about last time, and the British roots of the game of cricket within a new local or global context. And here's the comparison of the two games, and you'll be seeing an extended clip of it later. It's very interesting and exciting. On the left is the traditional match, what we call a test match, that boring 1956 version that many old traditionalists love. And here we have the spectacular T20 cricket. And you can look at some of the differences. A test match can last 8 hours per day over 5 days. A T20 match lasts 2 to 3 hours, about the length of an American baseball game. An outcome of a test match can be a win, loss, draw, or tie, so you could play for 5 days and the game could be a draw. Now in T20 cricket, or 2020 cricket, they have manufactured wins or losses. There is a way of doing it, so there is never a draw or a tie. The attire for test matches is predominantly white and traditional, and 2020 cricket is multicolored, with sponsorships across the chest of many of the national team jerseys. The rules for test matches are historically derived and were developed in England from when the ICC was located in London and were traditional and harder to change. T20 rules change all the time. They're entertainment driven. They're meant to generate maximum viewerships and an enthralling entertainment spectacle for consumers. Test matches as spectacle are commercially understated, where many people view it as slow or boring, something you kind of check in on every few hours to see how the team is doing. The T20 spectacle is commercially explicit. It's entertaining and infused with corporate branding everywhere you would see it. The test match is, of course, influence from the British tradition, and the influence of T20 is American commerce. So the argument is that soft Americanization has taken this traditional form of the game and modernized it in the contemporary age. So that is the difference between traditional test match cricket and spectacular 2020 cricket. And as I said, although 2020 cricket originated in the UK in 2003, it's been relatively developed fully and most successfully within India, and it's become a huge part of Indian culture in little over a decade. So we can talk about the rise of T20 or 2020 cricket within India, and hence the push for 2020 cricket within the rest of the cricket world as being an example of the Indianization of cricket. Cricket melds with soft Americanization to create this non-Western driven sport. And it's for young, urbanized, confident India and its emergent middle class who've taken the lead on the formerly colonial sport. They've taken the British colonial sport, they've infused it with its sport soft Americanization, and now projected it back out to the world as India has become the kind of center of the global sport system, cricket system. And here this non-Westernization, if there ever was one, has led to the dominance and influence of a non-Western nation. Perhaps this is our best example of a non-Western nation emerging and influencing global sport. And as I said, it's the melding or a hybrid of the two. And I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but you should. And here you have the American sports system and how it is influenced through this creation of a corporate sport model through T20 cricket. The focus is on profit, private ownership, financial growth, commercial products, market logics, and it's sport as entertainment, something we're familiar with here in the US, but runs contrary to many of the traditional deliveries of sport in Europe and in that British sport model. And here we see the IPL, the Indian Premier League, viewed as part of that Americanized sport corporate model and all these different elements. And I'll just pick on a couple of them because maybe you can read it and read up on the IPL and answer your topic assignment, your essay, or your discussion response based on these various elements. But let's look at a number of these then. And just to give you a bit more of a background, the Indian Premier League is 8 strategically located and market franchises. They are private franchises, and they're put in particular places for particular reasons, where the markets are. Commercial sponsorship is key. Player draft and auction is an important spectacle within and of itself. Each year there is a draft or an auction where the teams buy players effectively, and they're allowed to buy certain amounts of stars or local players. There's a focus on Indian and international market players, and it's structured over 8 weeks to create a high-intensity season. So it is a rapid number of games over a short period of time to get the excitement going to avoid dragging it out. 2 months from start to finish. All the best players from around the world, they nominate themselves to be available in the auction, and they go to India for 2 months and are able to play cricket a few matches per week and generate huge contracts and salaries from playing in this relatively short competition. Every game is televised because, of course, within the American sport model, television is key. Those broadcasting rights, those revenues are sizable and can lure the best talent from around the world. So it's clearly non-Western development form of the game, and perhaps the best example of this is that the IPL has completely adjusted the international cricket calendar. All of the international matches between Australia, India, New Zealand, South Africa, the cricket-playing nations, now carve out a 2-week break so the best international players can go to India and play in the IPL. So it's totally adjusted the entire international sport calendar around this 2-month spectacle of cricket. So let's look at this IPL, the Indian Premier League, in more detail. And I think now we can argue that it's a great example of globalization. It is both homogeneous and heterogeneous, to get back to what we talked about in the first module of this course. Now I'll give you a refresher that sporting globalization, it's about the local that is incorporated here. The tailoring of goods and services on a global basis to increasingly local and particular markets. So it's a global form of cricket, 2020, that is Indianized within the local Indian marketplace. And it's done in very interesting ways. It's almost an Americanized version of cricket because it follows that corporate sport model, which is cleverly localized to the preferences or wants of the Indian market. And this has been acknowledged by various people. I think in globalized terms, it applies these factors very effectively to the uniqueness of the local environment. That's what the IPL is, a global form of the game applied to the uniqueness of the local Indian market. And as the quote says here, quote, "The IPL is both homogeneous yet heterogeneous," end quote. It is a global form that is locally manifested, and I think that's a key thing to think of, that it's locally manifested within a non-Western context. Now here you can see a video that's quite interesting for the debut season of the IPL in 2008, and they talk about some of the issues and tensions perhaps that are arising from the perceived that were then the fully Americanized version of the game. In the intervening years, I would argue, since 2008, there has been less focus on the degree to which this is an Americanized form of cricket, and more the fact that the IPL is an Indianized form, and it's an expression of India's version of the game, not in traditional India, but in modern India, with that emergent middle class. But before we get into that, let's look at some of the other aspects of the IPL. And as we said, it's a franchise system and rational locations. The franchises are located in the biggest cricket markets within the nation, of course. It is a rational economic decision that they have made. There is a team organization, and it's a franchise structure, and it's a corporate cartel because there is private ownership of the league by the members or owners of the franchises that are part of this greater thing called the IPL. It's like the NFL, where the owners are a cartel who are in collaboration with each other to maximize profits. Now, they may compete on the field, but these owners collaborate to further the IPL organization and brand, just as the NFL owners do, and they prevent emergent owners from coming into the league or emergent franchises without the approval explicitly from the current ownership. And let's not forget, it's all about star players, and the entertainment and the player auction is an important role in helping to create the structure of the game around these star players, because players are auctioned off. Imagine a fantasy draft, if you will, at the beginning of every season. Imagine if in the NBA, at the beginning of the start of the season, all the players were available from the best nations around the world, and they could come to America to ply their trade in basketball, and the teams, the private franchises, would bid on the services for those players for that given season. That's really what we're talking about here. And here's an example in this video clip of what it is. And it's quite amazing, and it's pretty interesting how it's done. The different franchises every year bid for these players, and they offer them lucrative contracts to incentivize them to give up 2 months of their time to exchange their labor for massive contracts. And I can't overstate how important this is for some of the best cricket players from some of the semi-peripheral cricket nations like New Zealand or South Africa, where those players, if they played in the professional leagues in New Zealand, for instance, they could generate maybe $100,000 for the year. If they go to India to play in the IPL for 2 months, they can generate upwards of $1 million for 2 months of labor. So what would you do if you were in their situation? And what we see is that it's oftentimes shifting the hierarchy of domestic leagues in some of those peripheral or semi-peripheral nations. Even Australia, most of the best Australian players will go to the IPL for 2 months to ply their trade, cash in on their major sponsorships and their major contracts within the IPL. However, there also within these players, there's a global and local element to the distribution of players. The IPL relies on its global identity, its international star brand. So particular iconic star players like Chris Gayle from the West Indies are picked up by teams and provide those teams with a global international identity. Some teams rely on local Indian players to carve out their own more localized identity. So they have an insurance. These clubs create, through the contracting of players, a local or global or maybe even global identity as they put their teams together. You have that mixture of the global and the local with the playing personnel of each franchise. Now, there are no more than 11 foreign players to each squad, and there must be a required quota of Indian players to ensure that the Indian players continue with opportunities. So you can see this is a good mixture of global and local within the IPL. Brand, title sponsors, and corporate sponsorship is huge. Pepsi took over the title sponsor in 2013 and paid $650 million over 4 years to be the official league sponsor. Title brand sponsorship is big, but corporate sponsors is everywhere, as you'll see within the game. And it's a very, very highly commercialized game, even to the point that Pepsi is on the stumps and the wickets, on the apparatus of the game itself. They're absolutely everywhere. And as a result, players are oftentimes walking billboards. If you can try and see, these players are plastered with logos like a NASCAR driver. It's quite amazing, and it's a significant element of the spectacle, the logos and brand identities that are communicated through the viewership or spectator. And why is that? Because the audience for the IPL are generally young people, and it's dominated by young by India's young middle class of city dwellers, and that new affluence has disposable income and that they are willing to spend on cricket or brands associated with cricket. An important part of this market is women, who make up 45% of viewers, and even a higher percentage at the ground spectating are women as well. So it's a youthful India that are trying to attract youthful, diverse consumers, and they're the ones with the money, and they're the ones who are willing to spend. The IPL can be considered a form of middle-class leisure sport consumption. It is the domain of a relatively affluent group of people from India, because remember, there may be 300 million in the middle class, but there are hundreds of millions of impoverished people who could not afford a television or a ticket to the game. And here, this demonstrates this. The tickets for admission to a Delhi Daredevils ranged from $6 to $460 in 2011. Now, taking into account that at the time when 450 million people in India were living on $1.25 per day, and the minimum ticket is more than 4 times what they'd earn in a single day, the average salary was estimated to be $3.67. So you can see that this isn't something that is accessible to a large percentage of the Indian population. It is a form of sport and leisure consumption for the middle class and above. And here you can see the crowds at that game, their families, their women, their middle class men and middle class people who are there. So there's clearly a market that these sponsors are tapping into and that they're targeted at. And as I said previously, it is a youthful element that they are looking for, with shorter attention spans, multimedia oriented, and you can see that you must have 6 players under the age of 22 years old on each of the squads. Youthful players are more attractive to youthful audiences, and it's quite understandable. Secondly, they schedule games during evenings rather than during the day. That allows young professionals to attend and view the games at night for 2 or 3 hours, similar to how baseball has transitioned from day games to night games to allow maximum attendance, spectatorship, and viewership on television. And as it states here, IPL T20 cricket or 2020 cricket is the game for that modern, urban, young Indian population. They're modern, they live in urban environments, they are professional, and they have important jobs. They are the middle class in terms of their consumption, and the game fits within the rhythm of urban industrial life because it is a quite quick, spectacular version of the game. These people don't have the patience nor the time to spend watching 8 hours of cricket over 5 days. They want high levels of entertainment and instant gratification. So all these things fit into the rhythms of that type of urban life within the contemporary urban city. And that's why it's an expression of young contemporary India. And another way that the game is linked, this form of entertainment and spectacle is created through clear linkages between IPL cricket and Bollywood, the Indian film industry centered around Mumbai. As you may know by now, a number of the IPL franchises are owned or co-owned by Bollywood icons. Some of them you can see here. They are high-profile celebrity owners. They're at games, and they make the spectacle even more celebrity-laden and celebrity-interested by the consuming populace. And here you can see Shah Rukh Khan is well known for being an owner of the Knight Riders, and here he is in an early promotional video for the team, and you can see clearly how there's a blending or fusion between IPL cricket and Bollywood aesthetics, singing, dancing, etc. And this is all about the Knight Riders. That synthesis between cricket and Bollywood is another example of this globalization of the sport spectacle. Another thing that makes the level of entertainment important and make it an entertainment-driven spectacle is the soft Americanization, again, as the way the game is presented using cheerleaders. Originally, American cheerleaders came from the NFL in the first years, but they have drafted in American cheerleaders to do American-style cheerleading during IPL games in a way of nurturing or embellishing that spectacle. Now, this didn't go without criticism from the general population, and you saw that clip from 2008 where the guy wasn't too sure about these types of cheerleaders within that IPL Indian context. So as well as that, you've got Indian-style cheerleaders who are much more anchored within Indian dance and dress. So very, very different from the American-style cheerleading, and here again is an example of the globalizing of the spectacle in India. It's a dance entertainment that is localized to the indigenous preferences. This change has won over the majority of the people, and these cheerleaders are kind of fixtures within IPL cricket. So I've given you a lot of background on the way T20 cricket has been Indianized or globalized. Now look at it for yourself. Here's an extended clip from the 2014 final, and you can see that it's what it's like. You see high levels of various different commercialization, brand sponsorship, celebrity presence, the entertainment values that you would come and expect in American sport. They're all doing things, all working together to create the IPL spectacle. And I think what you'll find then is this, that there are clear distinctions between the colonial test match of cricket, that spectacular modern post-colonial form, and what the IPL is. And here we go, the rise of the non-West. It is through the game of cricket in India that we can see the rise of the non-West affecting the contemporary global sports system. It was used by Indians as a way to mark Indian national pride, to beat the colonizer at its own game, and now it's been localized or indigenized, not only to an economic or cultural sense, but in a political sense of a marker of new India. So compare and contrast the first video that we showed you with the IPL or perhaps the international T20 match. And here's what we have here. This is the final over, so that's the final 6 balls from the Cricket World Cup in 2015. It was hosted in New Zealand and Australia. The semifinal here where New Zealand was playing was hosted in New Zealand. And you can see the excitement, the level of drama as it gets down to the penultimate ball, and Grant Elliott, who ironically was born in South Africa, playing for New Zealand, hits a walk-off 6, so the equivalent of a walk-off home run, and the crowd goes crazy. This is a huge departure from that first video of the stodgy 1950s version of cricket that had come to dominate the world system. So I want you to think about that comparison then. The comparison between the traditional test match version of cricket and this more spectacularized T20 version that's been influenced on the international stage by everything that's been happening in India. So in summary, cricket in India and the IPL specifically is a great example of sport culture and the post-westernization of the global sports system in a cricket sense. But what the IPL is, as Rowe and Gilmore give a classic quote here, it's a strange hybrid of English village cricket, or the game-oriented, the soft Americanization, commercialization, mass mediaization, and celebritization epitomized by the Super Bowl, but also of Bollywood as well. Not only the entertainment aesthetic of Bollywood, but the celebrity figures that are associated with the game. You link those 3 things together, and you have this contemporary sports spectacle that is built for the middle-class Indian urban professional market. And that is quite a different type of development of a sport entity than we've seen previously. And for that reason, I think we can see India as a post-Western sporting power. It is doing its own thing. Yes, it's borrowing from the UK and the US in particular ways, but it's taking those borrowed elements and crafting its own sport culture rather than having something externally imposed upon it. So yes, there are elements of Britain and America in there, but it is first and foremost an Indian construction or form of culture, and I think that's why we can see it as a classic example of post-Westernization. Now, there are other examples as well, examples of where the IPL has had influence on other ways, other local sport cultures, and how they've emerged in India as well. So in October 2014, it was the start of the Hero being the sponsor, Indian Super League, which is a professional soccer league in India. And it's following a similar franchise structure with celebrity involvement, and the goal, as it here states, is to further the Indian game of soccer. It is not about importing an external sporting structure. It's about developing the game at a highly professional level as an entertainment spectacle, similar to the IPL, to grow the game of soccer in India. And here's a quite interesting promotion as well for the Hero Indian Super League. Slightly different, but we have the Elite Football League of India, which has been going for a couple of years. Again, it is obviously borrowing from the US, but it is doing so quite in an IPL way. It's not trying to compete with the NFL, but is looking to offer India its own version of American football culture and experience a largely televisual experience for a home audience that the Indian population might identify with. And so there's 2 external ones coming in and being localized, the localization of the American game. And lastly, we have Kabaddi, which isn't a game I know a whole lot about, but it's fascinating if you look at it. It is an Indian traditional pastime and really a team sport involving wrestling-type movements. And as a team sport based on contact that has been played for roughly 500 years within India. It doesn't get any more traditional than kabaddi, in other words. It's fallen by the wayside in certain areas because of the population of the IPL and other modern game forms. So what they've done is they've tried to reinvent this traditional game, modernize it in the mold of the IPL and the way that it has been structured. So what we have had recently is the development of a pro kabaddi league, and it follows the IPL structure with high-profile owners, celebrity-type partners, and various ways of mediating the spectacle as a televisual product to make it more entertaining and appealing to consuming audiences. So yes, you can see there are influences coming from abroad, but the post-Western nature of Indian sport culture means that it wants to develop its own or its concerned brand of sport and commercial structures. Why, you might ask? Because there is a market for these various forms of leisure consumption. So they want to try to recreate them as options for the 300 million strong middle class that has emerged as India has emerged on the global system as an independent and flourishing country. Yes, India beams its global sports spectacles such as the English Premier League or the NBA. However, it's developed its own non-Western forms of the games and influenced back outward from India a highly commercialized and lucrative entertainment sports spectacle centered around some of these activities. It may not succeed completely in the end, but the IPL model provides an example of how sports can be created to engage this middle-class Indian consumers group and the different ways that the global sports system has been affected by the emergence of post-Western nations. So what I want you to do then is move on to the required readings, your discussion response, your topic assignment if you elect to do one from this topic, and of course complete your topic quiz.